So welcome to Conversations in Health. This is our fourth speaker in this fall series. We are incredibly honored to have Dr. Francis Collins with us. I've had the good fortune to know Dr. Collins for a number of years, and we've served together, but he is really, as you all know from the readings, one of our really great American scientists and somebody who brings a remarkable degree of thought on the hardest issues of our day. Trust, faith, science, how we think as a public community. I can't think of a better person to be here at Georgetown with us, so thank you. Let's, as I told you, we like to start at the beginning. So, isn't that many years ago, but a little bit about where you grew up and the path that you went on to get to, maybe bring us relatively quickly up to where you ended up in college, because I think we'd like to spend a little time there and what your life was. So let's start at the beginning, please.
Well, I grew up on a farm about 3 hours from here in the Shenandoah Valley. Anybody who's driven down Interstate 81, you know it's a beautiful part of the world in between the Blue Ridge and the Alleghenies. The farm I grew up on was 98 acres. It was 7 miles away from Stanton, which is how you pronounce it if you live there, even though people who don't know that call it Staunton. It's really Stanton. Just be aware if you want to be welcomed by the people in the town. It was a pretty austere way to grow up in terms of the physical facilities, because we had no indoor plumbing. And growing up that way, it didn't seem like a big deal, but right. People now are like, what? How did you manage that? So bathing was a bit of a challenge. In the summer, I would bathe in the horse trough because it was the right size, and you could freshen up the water a bit. And I didn't go to school till the 6th grade. Now this all sounds very much like, down and out. Well, what, was your father a coal miner? No, my dad was a professor. He was a professor of drama at the Mary Baldwin College, which is in Stanton. And my mother was a playwright. And I'm the youngest of 4 boys. And my parents felt that they, both with Yale degrees, would be better at educating their 4 boys than the local county schools. And I think they were probably right about that. My oldest brother went all the way through his entire high school education without going to a formal school. And by the time they got to me, it was like, we can start out this way, but I don't think we're going to take it all the way to grade 12. So I went to public school in grade 6. Because we, at that point, moved in town. My grandmother lived in town and had a stroke and needed somebody in the house. And the schools in town were a lot better. And it was perfect, because my mother was my main teacher, had such a gift for getting you excited about learning stuff. This was not like a chore. This was a joy. As far as I could tell, there were no lesson plans.
Or at least none revealed to you.
None revealed to me. And her method of teaching was, okay, what's interesting today? Well, maybe it's going to be mathematics. And so, okay, I had a brother who was just a year older than me, so she kind of taught the 2 of us the same thing at the same time, a classroom of 2. And we would basically continue to study that thing, sometimes for like 3 days in a row without doing anything else, because it was interesting. And weren't going to sort of stop because, the clock says we should now do history. We'll get to that. And then after 3 days or whatever, it wasn't interesting, and then, okay, now we'll do history. Or maybe we'll do literature. Or maybe we'll talk about languages. My mother was a playwright. She loved words. That's probably why her plays never made it to New York, because they were wordy. But she was a writer, a poet, and she wanted us to understand grammar, and particularly about where do words come from, to the point where we'd play a game where she would pick out a word, and she said, where do you think that came from? Is that from the Greek, or from the Latin, or is that maybe Old French, or does that sound more like Anglo-Saxon? And then there was the arbiter of what was true, which was the Oxford Unabridged Dictionary off in the corner. So you would make your guess, and then you would look it up. And after a while, I got pretty good at it. Yeah. There are ways to do this. And it made you really interested in words and what they meant and where they came from. It was also a place where music was a big part of our daily experience. We did not have a television, but my father had been a folk song collector in North Carolina, and then subsequently, growing up in Virginia, a lot of the folk musicians that he had met in the 30s and 40s would come by our farmhouse. Oftentimes because they ran out of money. They wanted a place with a warm bed and a warm meal. But then they would hang around and play music. So this was very much what, in my house, I thought was totally normal. After dinner, people will sort of pull out instruments and start playing. I will tell you one little funny story about that. And also, young singers who were in this early days of the folk tradition would sometimes be brought by our farmhouse for my dad to listen to, because the word was he could really give you good advice about how to make your craft even better. And this one young man showed up on a particularly stormy night. A young man, it turned out, was having his 18th birthday that very night. And so he did a little bit of his work in front of my dad. And I'm probably 11 years old at the time, and I'm off in the corner listening. And after he goes, I say to my dad, well, I hope you told that one he has no future. Because, you know, his guitar playing was really rudimentary. He has no social skills at all, and his voice is just horrible. Yeah, that was Bob Dylan. Who at that point was called Zimmerman from Minnesota. So yeah.
So we might agree. We might follow you on many things, but not on predicting future stardom in the music industry.
Don't go by my opinion, at least at age 11. So it was a great way to grow up. I didn't grow up with much science exposure at that point, but then getting to public schools, I had that chance. And in the 10th grade, I had a chemistry teacher, John House, who was able to convey by every way that he taught the course why science was so incredibly interesting. It was a detective story. You know, there's truth out there to be discovered. And your experiments are your way that you can find it. And sometimes you get a clue and it turns out it's leading you the wrong direction, so you have to be clever about it. But ultimately, you find out how nature works. And I thought, that is what I want to do. I didn't know that until that class, and then I knew that. And because it was a chemistry class, I figured, okay, I'm supposed to be a chemist. And I stuck with that. Finished up high school and then went to the University of Virginia, my state school. The tuition was $900 a year. Imagine that. And it was a good thing because by that time my parents had run out of money, so I had to pay my way through. But I didn't end up with loans because I could work in the summer and make enough to do this. That's the way it ought to be.
Absolutely.
And so what to major in? Well, chemistry, of course. Where's biology in all this? I was really not interested. Biology, the way I was exposed to it in high school, it was all descriptive. There wasn't really any thinking involved. It was memorizing stuff, and I didn't find that nearly as exciting as physics and chemistry and math. So I took no biology classes at the University of Virginia. I was a nerd of the worst kind. I mean, I was really into all of the science experiments and the math, and not so much else other than playing the guitar, which was my only effort to try to be sociable. And went all the way through that and graduated at age 20 with a degree in chemistry and went off to do the next thing, which is to get a PhD in chemistry, of course.
And where did you go for that?
I went to Yale, where my parents had gone.
So it's a family tradition.
A little bit of that. That was part of it. But I also had a wonderful undergraduate research advisor when I was a senior at UVA, a professor who had just arrived from, guess where, Yale, who was what you'd call a mathematical chemist, a theoretical chemist. His work was all done with computers and pencil and paper. There were no machines or test tubes. And that's what I decided I liked best. So Carl Trindle was my mentor, and I was his first student. I will go to his retirement symposium next February at UVA, after which he has racked up a long list of remarkably successful folks, maybe not me, in terms of chemistry. So I got that taste of it, and I liked that. And he, of course, having just come from Yale, said, well, there's some pretty good people there, so why not? So yeah, I jumped into the PhD program, and I found I really liked the challenge. A lot of what I was doing was trying to solve second-order differential equations that were kind of unsolvable, but you would try to make various approximations to get there.
Was it what you expected?
It was pretty much what I expected. It was hard, but it was in my sweet spot.
Okay.
I should add another thing. At this point, I'm married.
What?
I got married at 19. And by the time I'm a first-year graduate student, I have a daughter. That was a lot for a guy who is still growing up himself to now try to figure out how to be a dad. But I loved that part just the same. It was challenging, trying to make this all work.
And you all lived in Connecticut at this point?
We lived in Connecticut in a little dingy place in Milford, and I went in every day to work with my equations and my computer cards. Now, you computer geeks can probably not imagine what that was like. So the programming language was Fortran. And the way that you would actually write a program was you had to put it in punch cards. And my programs got to be pretty elaborate. I was trying to calculate from mathematical principles what happens when you bounce protons off of hydrogen gas and you transfer translational energy into vibrational energy. I know that sounds supremely geeky, and it was, but this is pretty hard. That sounds like the simplest possible collision, but to do this from first principles, solving Schrodinger's equation was a bit of a bear. And so I would end up with 3 or 4 boxes of these cards. And woe be the day where you tripped and dropped one of them. And I would have to walk across a campus, oftentimes in the snow and the rain, to get to the computer center where there was an IBM 360 computer, which had far less power than your phone does. But at the time, it was the thing. And my advisor didn't have a lot of money in his budget, and so he was always complaining that I was spending too much in the computer time because you had to pay.
Right.
And so he said, you know, if you're going to do those things, you got to go when the price goes down, which is after 11 o'clock. So a lot of my work was done in the middle of the night when the price was right.
And your child was probably crying.
And the child was asleep at that point.
Yeah.
Then I came home and wanted to go to sleep, and the child wanted to play. So yeah, it was an odd experience, but it was what you do. I didn't think much about it. And then something happened.
I was going to say, this seems like we're building up to the...
We're building up to something. So by the time I'm a second-year graduate student, I'm feeling like it's going okay. There's something missing here, though. It feels pretty abstract. And I'm feeling sort of a little longing to have more of a connection to humanity in what I'm doing. And I couldn't really argue that this was probably going to be much of that kind of contribution. And I would occasionally run into other graduate students who were working at late night, who were the night owls like me. And there was one, Jay, who was working in a lab 1 floor above me. And it was a chemistry lab, but they were studying DNA. It was the chemistry of DNA. This was Don Crothers, who was like one of those really leaders in DNA chemistry back in the 1970s. And so I got to know Jay a little bit, and we kind of got into this rhythm where at 2 o'clock in the morning, he would take a break, and I would take a break, and we'd each tell each other what we were doing at that moment. And I would tell him what I was doing, and he's like, yeah, okay. And then he would tell me what he was doing. I was like, wow, you mean life actually makes sense? You've got this molecule that's like a digital record? I hadn't really paid attention to any of that. And you can study it, and you can understand how it replicates, and you can sort of see how sometimes things are misspelled and something happens, and there's a whole bunch of enzymes that make this thing replicatable and repairable, and wow, I had no idea. I thought, well, I better expand my horizons a little bit. I've narrowed them way too soon, so I signed up to take a graduate course in what was called biochemistry, but it was really molecular biology.
Okay.
And it just totally stunned me how much I had missed in this elegant story of how life really does make sense. all the way from the basic dogma of DNA makes RNA makes protein and all the other things that go with that. There was some cell biology in there as well. And then I had this sort of crisis. Okay, what am I going to do? This path has been so clearly laid out, and now I'm really doubting whether I've made the right decision, and I need to figure out if this is a calling to do something else, how am I going to make that happen? Many conversations with mentors in the Department of Chemistry, and ultimately I figured, okay, I've got to change, and I want to change in the biggest way, so that if I'm going to be a life scientist, I want to be able to do anything that a life scientist can do, and that probably means also right to the point of taking care of a patient who has a problem that I might be able to help. So I'm going to go to medical school.
Wow.
I'm like 22 years old at this point, and I'd never really thought about that until that point, which is unusual. And the chemistry department was sympathetic enough. They said, well, you've made pretty good progress here. We'll let you get your PhD as long as you do this additional set of things. And I applied to medical school, and I got in to the University of North Carolina. I still would love to know what was the conversation in the room after my interview, after I told this story, and the admissions committee had to decide whether to place a bet on this guy who seemed very late to the idea of being a physician.
When you made that decision, when you did make the call that you were going to make, did it feel right? Did you, were you still?
Wasn't sure. It was pretty uncertain, like complete turning upside down of my professional pathway. And I also remembered that the thing that I really didn't like about biology was that you had to memorize stuff. I'm not going to medical school. You think they make you do that? But I was enough all in to say, okay, I'm going to find out. And I sure hope I'm not going to crash and burn on this. So off I went to Chapel Hill. And, in the first couple of weeks, I figured out this is going to be okay. Yeah, I am going to have to memorize a lot of stuff, but it's stuff that I kind of care about. It's not It's not like the parts of the crayfish, which is what I really did not like in high school biology. It's about humanity and things that might matter someday if I'm going to pretend that I can help people. And then, I think it was probably November, medical school started September, November, there was a 2-week session in genetics, just maybe 6 lectures. And the guy who taught it was a pediatrician, and he brought patients to class. Nobody had done that yet. He brought a young man with sickle cell disease. He brought a child with Down syndrome. He brought a very young infant with an inborn error of metabolism, galactosemia. He brought a older woman with quite dramatic neurofibromatosis. And he brought a offspring of somebody with Huntington's disease who knew she was at risk and talked about how it is to live with that kind of uncertainty over your head. And I was totally, totally sold. Like, this is what I'm looking for. It's about humans, but it's information, it's digital, there's some mathematics here. This is it. I finally got there. And then I told the people around me, yes, I'm going to be a medical geneticist. They're like, well, that isn't going to do any good. We don't understand this stuff nearly well enough to actually use it for clinical purposes. Are you kidding? Maybe you could be a pediatrician and, diagnose kids with dysmorphology. It's like, no, that's not what I had in mind. I guess, yeah. It was a little unnerving to realize that what I thought was the dream, most people thought would not happen in my lifetime. But I was still stuck on it. And I did get the opportunity later on when I was a resident. My department chairman, hearing that I still wanted to do this genetics thing and wanting to be supportive, made it possible for me to fly to the American Society of Human Genetics meeting in Vancouver and to spend 3 days with what was then a burgeoning field of the leaders of that field, many of whom were physicians, and I could see it's starting to work.
Gotcha.
And these are people that I could learn from and maybe ask to be my mentors. And that locked it down, that, okay, this is actually something that could work, and I want to do it. Bit of a long answer.
No, it's a good, but that's a great, so it seems that you took risks, you moved when you were in doubt, but you found the place where it started to make sense.
Yeah.
But we still have the problem at this point in your story of, we've got genetic information, but we don't have a way forward to think about treatment. Could you help us? You then moved into the space that was building around you like you were on the track as this field was exploding in knowledge and information.
And I could see that had a possibility, but it still seemed a long way away from actually leading to some kind of therapeutics. It was much more diagnostic in its view, and I didn't think that was good enough. It is interesting. I just mentioned going to that first human genetics meeting. Yesterday, I was in Boston at the current human genetics meeting. That first meeting, there were 200 people. Yesterday, I spoke to 5,000. It's like, wow, this is really blown up. There was something going on here.
So you had a sense for the right thing, a better sense than picking Bob Dylan, but a better sense.
Yeah,
But
track record is variable here.
not to telegraph too far in advance, but could you help us get to the place where your work, when you finished your studies, and you really got to build your own lab that
Yeah.
eventually led to the kind of work that led to the Human Genome Project?
Yeah, sure. So I trained in internal medicine. I did a residency. I was chief resident. And then I went back to Yale to do a molecular biology fellowship that also had some clinical genetics involved. It was very intense. It was very, actually initially pretty terrifying, because I was suddenly in a lab with a lot of other extremely well-trained postdocs, and I was supposed to know what I was doing. If you read my first chapter of The Road to Wisdom, you will know right at the beginning I tell you the story of my first project in that lab, which was a complete and utter failure. And I almost quit at that point, because I had spent 6 or 7 months working day and night on a project that was ultimately doomed. And was simply not, there was nothing you could retrieve from it. It was just done. The only thing you retrieve is learn how to be more careful about how you plan a project and anticipate what might go wrong instead of just hoping for the best, which is what I had done. So yeah, that was an intense experience. And then I finally got through all of this training, and by this time I'm 34, and got a job at the University of Michigan as an assistant professor, taking care of patients, teaching medical students, which I actually really enjoyed, and doing research. And I wanted to work on something that mattered, but sometimes the things that matter are the riskiest. So I had a wonderful chairman who was willing to support the idea that he might have this new faculty member who might not be publishing a lot of papers right away, because I wanted to try something really hard, which is to find the cause of cystic fibrosis. And that at that point seemed potentially impossible to achieve. You were looking for what might be a single base pair that was misspelled out of 3 billion. And all you had to really go on was studying families and trying to do linkage analysis to figure out what chromosome the gene was on. But it was still this huge sea of unknown material that you're going to have to sift through, looking for this tiny needle in the haystack. But I thought, okay, I'm starting out. It's my turn to decide what the project is, at least for a little while. I'll try this. And if I have a chairman who's not going to be on my case about where's your latest publication, maybe this is the place to do it. It was super hard. And I thought many times during those first 3.5 years of not making much progress that I'm just failing. That pretty soon I'm going to have to admit I'm just not cut out to do this. It was maybe unwise to tackle something this hard. And then a little glimmer of things started to work. And then I realized something that stuck with me my entire life is, if you're trying to solve a really hard problem and you have other people around you who have sort of complementary approaches to it, maybe you should talk about working together. And Lapchi Choi was this really wonderful PhD researcher in Toronto who was also trying to find the cause of cystic fibrosis. And we were competitors, but friendly competitors. And his approach and my approach were actually beautifully synergistic. And so we sat down together and said, why are we chasing each other? Why don't we chase the rest of the field together? And decided on the spot, we're going to merge our labs.
Wow.
And we did. And my trainees got to know his trainees and all got to be friends. And Toronto and Ann Arbor, it's about 5.5 hours apart. But so we would have lab meetings in London, Ontario, in a really dingy Holiday Inn, which was halfway in between. And remember, those were the days. There was no internet to speak of. There were no ways you could email each other. Fax machines. We were always getting data by fax machines. But it started to work. And there was that day, it was a night actually, in May of 1989. Lapchi and I were at a meeting, oddly enough, at Yale, working on some chromosome problem that was needing to be solved. And we had set up a fax machine in the dorm room, just in case there was new data. And came back that night after a long day. And there were paper all over the floor. And pull it out and look at it, and there it was.
Wow.
3 missing letters in an exon of this previously unknown gene. That was the most common cause of cystic fibrosis. This is the famous delta F508 mutation, which 90% of people with CF have 1 or 2 copies of that, and which has now led to, 30 years later, a drug treatment for cystic fibrosis that is just downright miraculous.
Wow. And that would have been an amazing life story if you stopped there. But then you decided to take on a larger collaborative project, which was the first time I came across you in the Clinton years,
Yes.
when you took on the Human Genome Project, which is more than one.
What was that about? Well, having gone down this road for cystic fibrosis and recognizing if you really want to understand the thousands of rare genetic diseases, CF was probably one of the easiest ones because it was more common. You had more families. It was also very predictable. It was what you'd call really Mendelian. And the others are going to be harder. And the idea we would have to do this 5-year, probably $50 million worth of resources over and over, it's ridiculous. No, you need a reference copy of the human genome, and then everything will change. So I was a big fan of the Human Genome Project. Not everybody was. You may be surprised to know. The majority of the scientific community in 1989 was opposed. They thought the Genome Project was unworkable. We'll never be able to do that kind of 3 billion letters, because right then you were lucky on an afternoon to be able to sequence about 100. Or they thought it was going to cost too much, and of course worried it was going to take money away from their research. The zero-sum idea. And then most offensive to me, because I was a fan of the project, was only mediocre people will want to work on this. It's going to be so boring. A, C, G, T over and over again, 3 billion times. Who cares? It's probably all junk anyway. But fortunately, the wiser heads prevailed, saying, you really can't be against this. The idea, this is our shared humanity. Yeah, it's going to be really hard to understand, but it will empower so many other approaches. We just got to do it. And Jim Watson, who was, of course, the Watson of Watson and Crick, agreed to be the first leader of the US Genome Project. And I had a little bit to do with encouraging him to make that decision. And I admit, sort of starstruck to sit at a table with Jim Watson and talk about, he wanted my opinion? Wow. That is hard to imagine. So he did take it on, although it didn't go very well. Jim Watson, for all of his star properties, had very little of a governor on what he said. And at that point, the NIH director was Bernadine Healy, who was a really smart and really determined, pretty tough-minded person to try to drive research forward. And Jim, who I think also was not particularly positive about women in his particular area of research, insulted her a few times. And ultimately she said, okay, you're gone. This was a bad moment. Genome Project at that point was like 1.5 years old. People were still opposed to it. Not much progress had been made. And my phone rang. And it was an invitation to apply to be the next director. What? I mean, no, that can't be right. I'm an academic. I'm doing research here. We'd found the neurofibromatosis gene at that point. We were on the trail of Huntington's gene. Like, I'm fine. Get somebody else. So they kept asking. I kept saying no. I'll tell you a silly story. I'm telling a lot of stories. Is this all right?
It's okay. It's okay. We'll get to the discussion
we'll
about
get
the NIH and the future of but
Okay, quick story. So I have said no, and Bernadine Healy is like, okay, we'll start looking for somebody else. And then I was at NIH for a study section, and I got a note, Dr. Healy wants to see you. It's like, oh boy. So I go and I sit in the director's office, and she gives me the hard sell about this is the most significant job in all of biology and medicine that will happen in your lifetime. Yeah, there's some risks involved, but you're the right person to do it. You got me behind you. The Congress already seems to think this is worth doing. Yeah, Jim Watson was a little bit of a problem, but he got a lot of attention to this. Come on, Francis, you got to do this. And I've got my defenses up, and I guess it was obvious because she stopped. She said, Francis, damn it, I don't think I'm getting through to you. I said, well, I don't think you are. And she said, you know what? I just got this vision. It's a few decades from now. And yeah, I'm kind of an old lady, and I'm in this assisted living home, and I'm walking down the hallway with my walker. And I look up ahead of me, and here comes somebody with his walker. Oh my gosh, it's Francis Collins. And he comes up beside me, Bernadine says, he comes up beside me, and he turns and looks at me, and he says, damn it, Bernadine, I should have taken that job. Isn't that the dumbest thing anybody ever said to you in a job recruitment?
that's a first.
And it totally nailed me. It totally nailed me because she identified exactly what in the back of my mind was this deep anxiety that I was about to pass up the best opportunity I would ever have to do something really significant because it just wasn't the right time and I wasn't sure it was going to work. And yeah, maybe I would be in that hallway saying, damn it, I should have taken that job. So I went back home and I talked to my wife about it, and the next day I called and said yes. So yeah.
And the rest is history.
Well, yeah, a lot of it.
We have mapped a human genome.
We did over the next 12 years and ahead of schedule and under budget.
And I'm not going to dwell too much time on the NIH because I think we'll get many questions along that line.
Yeah.
But I do want to give Ella a heads up that he'll be the first question when we turn to the students.
Okay.
But
yeah, I'm going on much too long. I'm sorry.
No, not at all. No,
this.
this is why we have people come to not just talk about the headlines. But my question will be about the headlines.
Oh, okay.
So I do want to, before we transition to this, one of the reasons I wanted you to tell your story was that what we learn from, as you know, I'm a lawyer, but what I've learned about how we know how science evolves and grows and how we learn more is by investing in people who take chances, figure out something we didn't know before, and you never know where that can lead.
Yeah.
I'd ask you before we turn it over to reflect not only as the former head of NIH, but your experience as a scientist. Where do you think we are now? How do you sort of, what's your assessment of the most recent administration's policies, and how should we be thinking about those policies and how they affect the research enterprise? Because I think it is a transition moment here, and it's not a political one, it's just sort of an observational one, especially once we got a room full of people who are thinking about their futures in this space.
Sure. Well, you're asking a very serious question, and it comes at a very serious time. So I'm going to be a little less lighthearted now.
Sorry about that.
I came to NIH in 1993, so that's 32 years ago. I was part of transitions of administrations over all that time. And transitions always have consequences. There are things that happen that can be pretty unsettling. And usually after a while, things sort of settle back down. There has never been a transition, anything like what has happened beginning in January of this year in terms of its consequences for medical research, which I'm sorry to say have been almost entirely negative. The proposals that then rapidly became implemented to cut budgets, to cut grants, to cut staff, to attack universities, all of those things have come true in a way that was so rapid that it was really hard not to sort of be back on your heels the whole time. This flood of DOGE moves, executive orders. At NIH, 2,500 people who were there on January 20th are not there now, most of them without really much of an explanation of why. I'm not there now either, and that was not my intention or my plan, but it became sort of terminally unwelcome for me to stay beyond February 28th. The lab that I was running, 14 people, was transferred to another investigator, so at least those individuals, for the most part, were able to continue to work, although one of them was fired for no explanation since she had just received a superlative performance review. The termination now of some 2,000 research projects, initially focused on DEI, but spilling over into things that I would call health disparity research, which ought to be a high priority for our country, and HIV research, which has been decimated, and then other things that seem entirely politically driven, like we're not allowed to study vaccine hesitancy anymore. And what's happened to global health? Obviously, you all know the really disastrous dismantling of USAID and all the consequences there. But NIH has been the largest supporter of global health research in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Between NIH and the Gates Foundation, and we've worked very closely together while I was NIH director, that was about 60% of the world's funding for global health research. And the changes that have been made there, while they have not eliminated global health research by NIH, it's made it very difficult. So all told, it's been an unprecedented assault on something that never should have been political, which is coming at an ironic moment when progress in medical research has been just breathtaking in terms of what's been achieved just in the last few years. So many things that I didn't think it would happen in my lifetime are happening. We have CRISPR gene editing cures for sickle cell disease and for rare inborn errors of metabolism like that baby KJ that maybe you read about. My lab, my former lab, is only a year away from attempting a cure of this premature aging disease, progeria, with in vivo gene editing. And based on what we've seen in the animal models, I think it has a good chance of working. Cancer, immunotherapy, look what's happening in that space. We will agree with that. We have people with stage 4 cancer who are coming through that and are in remission, maybe are cured. I know some of them are with things like melanoma. And that gets better all the time with the next version of this, even for solid tumors. We're really starting to make headway. And all of that now is in a compromised state because of the changes that have been made. Changes that I don't think have been made with much consideration of the consequences and have certainly been extremely hurtful to a lot of the people doing the work, especially federal scientists who have been over and over again receiving really difficult messages of not being valued. After a while, you begin to wonder, is this really my calling anymore? So we're in trouble. What to do about that? A lot of people are working on trying to convince the part of the government that's described in Article 1 of the Constitution, that would be the Congress, that they have a stake here. And traditionally, gosh, in all my 12 years as NIH director, the Congress had this remarkably wonderful bipartisan support about medical research. Frankly, sometimes more by the Republicans than the Democrats.
Yes.
Between 2015 and 2022, the NIH budget went up by about 57%, and that was mostly with Republicans as chairs of appropriations. So we were on a great pathway there. And if the Congress could basically come back to that view, maybe they're trying, at least in the most recent appropriations markup, which hasn't yet become a reality, but it was a signal. They were rejecting the administration's proposal of a drastic 40% cut in NIH's budget and saying, no, it ought to be actually a little bit more than the current year. But that's not settled. We should not feel like, okay, we're all right now. That was a markup. As you know, we have a government shutdown now because they couldn't decide on a budget. And if they do reopen the government, which I certainly hope they will, it will still be under a continuing resolution, and we don't quite know how that's going to shape out because our politicians are even more polarized than the country. And so it's hard to see how we're going to get out of this mess by depending on our politicians. So yeah, I am really troubled about this. One thing I will tell you I'm doing is to try to build a story bank of patients who have been through medical challenges where medical research has provided them with opportunity to relieve suffering and maybe to escape what otherwise was going to be a really terrible outcome. And there's lots of those stories out there, but they're not collected anywhere. And from what I have learned by working with some of the people who are most on top with how you get messages to people in these troubled times, it's probably going to be social media. And that means these videos need to be no longer than 1 minute, and they need to grab your attention in the first 5 seconds. Otherwise, they're going to click and swipe, and you'll be gone. And the project's called We Are Living Proof. Voices of people who could say, I have this disease, that's who I am, and I am living proof that medical research can save lives because it saved mine. If we could get those out there, and this isn't political, it's not partisan, it's just like tell the world why this is such an amazing time for benevolent scientific actions that actually stimulate our economy, by the way, and shouldn't be on the list of things to just cut blindly, which is what's been happening. I'm making some progress on that. I hope we can launch it before the end of the year with a platform where all these videos can live and where journalists and legislatures and anybody who's interested in finding these can know where to look.
Count us in if we can help.
Okay, you're in.
So why don't we open it up? I'm going to start with Ella, to the students. And so Ella, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, first, thank you so much. It's been amazing to hear your story and all your amazing insights. So we read an interview to prepare for this that you did with the New Yorker, in which you said, science is caught up in a much larger disillusionment with the traditional foundations of how we decide what's true. And I also know that religion has been a large focus in your life. I wanted to ask, in your own kind of internal dialogue between science and religion, how do you personally decide what's true? And secondary to that, I wanted to ask what you believe is the difference between truth and belief.
Those are interesting and complex questions, but really important ones. Yeah, I tried to unpack this a little bit in this book called The Road to Wisdom, which I know some of you looked at the first chapter, but the second chapter is on truth, and the third chapter is on science, and the fourth chapter is on faith, all of which I think are relevant to our current circumstance. So in terms of truth, if we're talking about truth about nature, about the natural world, first of all, I think we have to agree that there is such a thing as objective truth. There are people these days who might deny that. The postmodernist movement, which started in the humanities, has spread in many directions, even to the point where people will say science is basically just a matter of people's opinions or cultural traditions, and there is no real objective truth behind it. I don't know any scientists who could do their work that way. So I hope you all will accept, when it comes to the natural world, there are things that are true, and we can discover them. And once we've discovered them, they are true, and they're established facts. And it's not okay for somebody to say, well, that was not true for me, because they don't like it. We're doing a lot of that these days. So truth is a real thing. There are ways to find it, establish it. It needs to be rechecked. You need to be sure that somebody didn't get the answer wrong. And then once it's there, that is part of what's holding society together over all these years, having a shared agreement about what Jonathan Rauch calls the constitution of knowledge, what we know collectively. We depend on that. But some of that's under attack now in circumstances where there are established facts that people, for their own purposes, are deciding they don't believe anymore. Now, what about faith? So I started out as an atheist. In graduate school, I was one of those people that didn't even want to hear about any idea that there could be something more than what science could measure. I was, I guess, a worshiper of the religion called scientism, which has sort of a prior assumption that there's nothing worth talking about that you can't measure scientifically. And I think there's a lot of scientists that are in that space. And then I went to medical school, and I sat at the bedside of people who were dying. And it was hard for me to imagine how I would handle that. It made me uncomfortable thinking about that. But I realized maybe I haven't done a lot of exploration here of why some people actually believe there is something outside of nature, namely God, that is worth thinking about. And I got challenged by a patient of mine who asked me one afternoon, "What do you believe?" And I realized I didn't know the answer. I hadn't done any work on this. So I won't go through the long 2-year traveling path that took me then through many ups and downs through philosophy and theology and multiple different world faiths, but ultimately landed me, to my great surprise, in becoming a Christian at age 27. But to answer your question, okay, so I believe in God, but I can't prove it. I believe, because I'm a Christian, that Jesus Christ was a real person, not a myth. I believe that Jesus actually died on the cross. There's good historical evidence for that. And I even believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, which is a shocking thing for a scientist to say. But if Jesus was also God, then I guess those natural laws could be suspended in that case, because God's the author of those laws. At least that would be my argument for consistency. So I believe those things, and some of them I would say I believe them as established facts, like the fact that Jesus was a real person.
Yep.
There's lots of non-biblical evidence to say that's the case. I believe that he rose from the dead because I think there is evidence for that, but that one's obviously a tougher one. So I'm not sure I would put that, if I'm trying to sort of make a distinction between established facts about nature, this is in a different category. And I think that's the way faith has to be. I don't think God intended for us to have a perfect proof of the answers to this question, because it was sort of a challenge for us to do the work ourselves and figure out just how much evidence do you think there is, and then you'll still have to decide whether to make that leap or not. I made that leap at 27. I'm glad I did. It changed my whole way of approaching things, and I don't see a conflict between science and faith, even in places like evolution, which I think was God's way of creating this amazing tapestry of organisms around the planet, and why people find that to be an unacceptable description of what's described in Genesis has always puzzled me. But anyway, that's a bit of a long answer, but it was a hard question.
Thanks for your answer.
Thanks, Ella. Chimako?
Yes.
I wanted to know, from your experience, what are the common mistakes, if any, that you've seen the scientific community make when communicating breakthroughs or new developments, like the COVID-19 vaccine, that maybe breed distrust or lead to the politicization of research? And then on top of that, what do you think is the key to rebuilding trust with the public when it comes to research?
Yeah. Well, I think we all have to look back at what happened with the communication process around COVID-19 and admit things went wrong, because we ended up with an awful lot of people not trusting the information, which was heartbreaking. Kaiser Family Foundation did a careful analysis of what the consequences of that was in terms of people who decided not to get vaccinated when it was very simple to do so, and end up dying. 234,000 Americans in graveyards because of misinformation and science communication that didn't win the day. it's easy, I suppose, to say, well, it was the social media people who were spreading all kinds of lies, and it's always true that things that make you angry or fearful spread more rapidly, and so there was a lot of that going on. It's easy to say there were politicians who were spreading falsehoods, who deserve some of the blame for all of the ways in which this went off. But I also have to point at myself. I was one of those people who was shoved in front of a camera to say to the public, here's what you should do to try to protect yourself from dying of COVID-19. And I would always do what I thought was the best information we had at that time, but I would know that it was incomplete, that we were learning about this virus day after day, and sometimes there were big surprises, like the fact that asymptomatic people can be super spreaders. We did not expect that. That wasn't the case with SARS and MERS, but it was sure the case with COVID-19. And so we would have to revise our recommendations, and people weren't expecting that, because, wait a minute, you said, and now you're saying, and we should have prepared them for that. There should have been a caveat in front of every recommendation. This is the best information we've got right now. We're going to try to give you information that maybe will help reduce your likelihood of catching this or dying. But we might have to change it in another few weeks because we'll learn something more. We didn't say that. And that's on me and the other people who were doing this, because we were so determined, we got to get people to take action. So just give it to them straight, like, this is the thing. And even if we knew this wasn't quite that simple, we didn't say so. So I learned from that. I think the other thing is, it would have been so much better if we'd had a community-based spreading of information from people that you knew in your local community. And some of that was happening with doctors who were willing to be out there, but an awful lot of what people were hearing about COVID was coming from what were seen to be kind of elitists, and many of them working for the government. And that didn't necessarily carry the same weight when they started to wonder about whether they could trust the information. So along the way, little by little, we lost trust of more than 50 million people. I was talking today to a guy who was living through this in Germany, and I've talked to others in other countries in Europe. And we were uniquely in a situation where people were losing trust even faster. And I think there are a lot of characteristics there that made that so. But boy, we had the worst of all worlds here in terms of mistakes being made. And the problem, of course, lives with us now, that a lot of the people who lost trust in science during COVID have continued to lose trust.
Right.
And trust in science is lower now than it was 2 years ago. It's continued to propagate itself. We have a really hard task in front of us to try to figure out how to bring that back.
Anju?
Hello, thanks for coming and thanks for talking to us once again. My question was sort of regarding how we can sort of balance collaboration and competition between like, the NIH and like the private pharmaceutical sector. So like what is the appropriate balance of collaboration and competition between the NIH and the private sector, particularly concerning the sharing of data, and also how we can prevent the privatization of publicly funded discoveries?
Great question, and one that I've thought about a lot. As NIH director, it was one of the things that I wanted to try to do is to identify places where we could get public and private sector to work together on a really hard problem that both agreed needed to be solved, but neither could do it really by themselves. It would have to be pre-competitive. Realistically, you're not going to get companies because it had to be open access. Everybody had to know what happened. So you're not going to get companies to come and share information about the latest breakthrough drug that they're not sure yet whether it's going to work. So we developed a program called AMP, the Accelerating Medicines Project, and a partnership, and started out with Alzheimer's disease and diabetes and autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis. And it was fascinating because this had never happened before in quite this way. Pharma paid half the cost, NIH paid half the cost. Each one got to figure out who were the right scientists to put in the room to design the project. And there was this attitude at first where the academic scientists funded by NIH were like, oh, these industry people, they're probably not that good. They went there because they weren't good enough to be at university like we are. And the industry people came in like, oh, these academic people, they just care about publishing papers. They don't really do very much. And they both found out they were totally wrong. And you could see the way in which they started knitting together, and you could figure out there was real synergy here in the different perspectives and experiences they had had. That project is still going on. This is now 13 years later. Started with 3 projects. There are now 10. And has made major advances in the areas I just mentioned, as well as things like Parkinson's disease and schizophrenia. And I think that model is possible as long as you're careful about how you set it up so that it doesn't discourage people from taking part. And again, I mentioned it's got to be pre-competitive, and it's got to be a really hard problem that's not otherwise solvable. And it's got to agree that it's all going to be open access. All the information is available to everybody. So it can be done. But the default is not to do that.
Right.
Certainly during COVID, March 28th of 2020, when it was pretty clear this was really getting into a bad place, it was clear that if we were going to get diagnostics and hopefully therapeutics and especially vaccines in record time, we had to have all of the components working together. And so I made probably 10 calls on that day to heads, chief scientists at pharmaceutical companies, because I knew them already because of this Accelerating Medicines partnership, and invited people to come the next week face-to-face for a meeting to figure out how we're going to, in an unprecedented way, work on COVID together. And they all showed up. And in another week, we had it set up with co-chairs from both places. And we kept the lawyers out of the room, sorry. Because normally this would have taken years
yes.
of debate about, well, what about the boundaries here and who gets the IP? No, people are dying. We got to do this. So with that motivation, you can make it happen. But the default is always like, man, kind of protect my part of it. We should push harder when those defaults happen. If we want to make progress and want to help people, we've got to figure out how to build something that takes advantage of all the talent.
Helena? Sorry.
Hi, I just I want to say thank you for sharing your story. I just kind of wanted to go back to genetics and genomics and CRISPR. As you mentioned before, I was wondering how you think the evolution of genomics and personalized medicine will transform patient care in the future, and kind of especially considering the ethical conversations around them right now.
Okay, that's about a 20-year program.
There are no simple questions here.
No, I can see that. No, it's a great question. I think particularly with CRISPR, we're talking about gene editing. And particularly, therefore, we're talking about places where there is an opportunity to change the spelling of a gene. When that comes to applying that to somatic cells in the tissues of somebody who has a genetic illness, I don't think that raises brand new ethical questions. It is part of what we've been trying to do for a long time. It's less dramatic if you're going to edit the bone marrow to cure somebody of sickle cell disease than if you gave them a bone marrow transplant with somebody else's entire genome. So that part is pretty straightforward. And it is so exciting to see this happening. What happened with that baby KJ that I mentioned, born with a lethal urea cycle disorder that by now he would be dead. And in the space of just 6 months, while he was getting hospital support to get through this, they went from soup to nuts and built what you call a bespoke gene editor just for his mutation, packaged it up with the appropriate editing apparatus in a lipid nanoparticle, delivered it to his liver, and dang, it worked.
It's incredible.
6 months. That's the proof of principle. Now, there's thousands of rare genetic diseases that seems to me could be approached this way. This almost sounds scalable instead of having to take each one of those diseases one at a time and spend 20 years trying to figure out what to do. So I'm totally excited about that. The ethical issues for CRISPR, I think, fall into the space of embryos. You may know there was one rogue scientist in China 7 or 8 years ago who actually did apply CRISPR to embryos, and there were 2 little girls born where he intended to try to inactivate a particular gene called CCR5, which he was arguing would protect them against HIV. The argument for that is a little thin. Best way to protect yourself against HIV is not get exposed. And actually, what he was offering them was not all that 100% certain either. There are other ways to get around that. And there was no real international consultation about this, and the consent that the parents supposedly gave seemed extremely sketchy, like they weren't quite sure what was happening. And he went ahead and did it and then announced it. That was a real breach of any kind of principles of how you handle a difficult ethical situation. And there was an immediate international outcry, and he actually went to jail for a couple of years. Although, I gotta say, I think when he first announced this, I think his superiors in China thought, oh, this is great, we're first. And only after the fact they realized, oh, maybe we should have been first. I'm concerned, though, that as now the time has gone by and there's effectively a moratorium across the world about not doing this, that the support for that moratorium is getting thinner. And there are more and more people going, well, you know, now we're getting better about how to do this without having so-called off-target effects. Maybe we should start to use this a little more. Maybe we could eliminate some genetic diseases this way. I have a very hard time identifying a circumstance where for medical reasons you could justify that, but there are a lot of people contemplating it. And so there are lots of ethics meetings about this. In my view, this is crossing a line that worries me a lot. This is basically deciding whether we are going to reinvent our own species. And especially if people are talking about using this to try to optimize characteristics like intelligence, athletic abilities, musical talent, good looks. It starts you down a very troubling, dangerous, and not very scientific pathway that I think is the wrong use of this kind of amazing technology.
Zipporah?
Hi, yes. So I just wanted to thank you again for being with us. Everything that you've said has been really insightful. And my question is, so in a world where technology and data drive discovery, it feels like there's just this constant pressure to move faster and be more efficient and almost compete with computers to create something new. So I just wanted to know, how can scientists keep their work centered on people and authenticity under that pressure?
There is a lot of that pressure, and every scientist these days is thinking about what can I do a little quicker than my competition. And I will have to say sometimes that maybe leads scientists to rush things that they aren't really as sure of as they should be. And we got to be really careful about that and not start to get sloppy about replicating results and making sure you've got the answer right. Because there is a lot of pressure about that to get something done and submitted and published. I think, though, what you're saying is the most important thing is, wait a minute, why are we doing this? It is not necessarily to put more lines in your CV. And it can sometimes sort of look that way in some of the academic pressures that people have. Oh, if I'm going to get tenure, I've got to have, you know, this grant and those 3 publications. No, you've got to advance science in a way that benefits humanity. And they might not be the same thing. So, yeah, we have to keep reminding ourselves, why are we doing this? I think most scientists know that. I mean, I talk to a lot of people and ask them, what got you into biomedical science? And it would be a rare person who didn't say something about, you know, I thought maybe I could help somebody. That is a deep driving motivation behind almost all of us. But it can get pushed aside. I bet you have a lot of motivations that get pushed aside sometimes too, when there's a lot of stress and deadlines that you kind of forget about. Why am I doing this? Scientists can have that same situation. And maybe our culture could stand to be a little bit better of a reminder about why we're doing this instead of the constant pressure to show that you're producing. I'm with you on that. And I'm sorry to say the peer review system probably adds to that, and the grant system at NIH where, you know, even in a good year, you send in a grant, your chance of getting funded is about 20%. And so that means you're spending a lot of your time just writing another grant because that one didn't quite make it, or revising that one because it
Right.
didn't quite. This is not a healthy system. I think we ought to have a system where we could fund at least a third, and maybe even 40%, because you can't tell the difference between a grant that scores at the 30th percentile and one that's at 20th. When you get to 40 or 50, yeah, then it's starting, you can say, that one's probably not so good. But we are leaving a lot of great science on the table, and that frustrates the scientists, who then maybe end up getting distracted from their real goal, which is to make discoveries that are going to help somebody. It's partly our system's fault, too.
So now I'm going to open this up to students in the class who may have questions, and who haven't already spoken, because the 5 we've heard from are the ones who did their briefing
And
emails
they
for
were
you.
great.
So I'm just going to go sort of from left to right. So on this side, anybody got additional questions? All right, so, okay, I've got 1 and 2. Okay, please.
Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us. You spoke about federal tax on science, and I was wondering, as a young person and a prospective medical professional, what are some things that us college students can do to sort of fight back against these attacks by the administration on science?
I think we all have to be prepared to tell our own stories, not in a aggressive, mudslinging way, but explain why you believe that this is a valuable investment based on what your own dreams are. Yesterday at the American Society of Human Genetics, talking to these 5,000 people, everybody I saw said, I want to know, what can I do? And they had a number of suggestions of what people can do, right down to write your congressman.
Yep.
Make an appointment, go meet with your congressman. Invite your congressman to come to your lab and see what you do. That
Well,
makes a huge difference.
And people, I think, don't understand the power of that. I don't mean to interrupt.
No,
So-
I'm glad you're jumping in, because it's about relationships oftentimes. That's what really changes people's views, not statistics or diagrams of economic return on investment. It's relationships. So we should be out there to anybody who'll listen, describing why this is something that our nation has been triumphant about. We have led the world, the United States has, for at least 3 decades in biomedical research, unquestionably. Our universities are the strongest in the world by far. Why would we want to start knocking these things down? And that also means being comfortable talking to people who don't agree with you. We have to relearn that experience and not talking to them by lecturing them, but talking to them by listening to why they don't agree with you and then trying to understand that well enough to see if you can actually gain their confidence. People will be much more likely to listen to your view if you've already demonstrated you're respectful enough to listen to theirs. A lot of that skill seems to be in short supply these days.
We need a national open house day for research labs so people can come and see what's out there. Please.
I just want to thank you again for coming, and I think you have a very interesting perspective on certain things, which I like. I wanted to ask you, what spiritual disciplines sustain you in high stakes, like scientific leadership and decision making, and how has your prayer life changed since you wrote The Language of God and it was published in 2006? Sorry.
Spiritual disciplines. Yeah, there are whole books written about that. Dallas Willard is one of my favorite authors who particularly writes compelling in that space. I can't say that I'm a perfect model of how to practice such disciplines. I know more about them than I sometimes actually put into practice. But I'm awake most days at 5 a.m. and the first thing, unless there's some real crisis going on to distract me, that I want to do is to spend a little time in prayer and maybe in a devotional or maybe reading some Bible. And in that process, trying to get an anchor on what's my day going to be like. And I'm often struggling with some issue about what should I do, what's the right thing. And I'm hoping in that to get grounded enough to have a better sense of what the answer might be. I don't see prayer as an opportunity to manipulate God into having it my way. I think it's more my opportunity to get some insight, which I take from God, about something that I'm mixed up about, and maybe some wisdom can be provided. James chapter 1, verse 5. If any of you lack wisdom, then ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given. That's one of those verses I think about a lot when I'm really needing wisdom. So that's there. And in terms of things that have happened since I wrote The Language of God, yeah, that was 19 years ago. I think my faith has evolved in certain ways. I've run through periods of doubt sometimes, and by the way, I think that's normal. Doubt is not the opposite of faith, it's an element of faith. And it's often an opportunity to recognize you got some work to do here. That if you've encountered that, it's probably because there's something you haven't really explored in enough depth. So, yeah, gone through some of those experiences, but come out the other side still feeling like this is a rock I can stand on in the middle of the storm. And there's certainly plenty of storms, and COVID-19 and the year 2020 was one of those that was unlike anything I'd ever been through.
Well, it's on the right-hand side in our class, so I've got one. So we had 1, 2, and 3. So we'll try to, please, Natalie, why don't you start us off?
I had a question building off of that. So how do you see religion and science fitting together? So in Christianity, or I guess all of religions, it's viewed that God created the world. So God made the laws for the natural world, which science is discovering the laws of the natural world. In that case, why there are so many contradictions, and there's a lot of pushback traditionally from religion against scientific advancements.
Yeah, great question. I think we have to figure out which of those conflicts are actually inherent and which of those are ones that we humans have somehow come up with. I like the phrase that comes from Francis Bacon, probably 600 years ago, that God gave us two books. The book of God's words, that's the Bible, and the book of God's works, which is nature. And if they're both God's books, then it doesn't make sense that they would have conflicts within them. And if somebody is pointing to a conflict, then we should look carefully to see, well, wait a minute, why is that being called a conflict, and where does that come from? Obviously, an area where there's traditionally a conflict is about origins. Where did we come from? An ultra-literal reading of Genesis 1 and 2 would say that we humans were created from the dust, that therefore we are not part of the rest of the living tapestry of created plants and animals. And also that the earth is only 6,000 years old. And there are lots of people in traditional conservative churches who take that as the answer and are very troubled by any other interpretation, which gets in real difficulty. Because if you look at the data and the evidence from multiple different directions, first of all, the universe is 13.55 billion years old, and the earth is about 4.5 billion years old. You can't really look at the data and reject that. So this interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2 can't be right. But now wait a minute, does that mean there's a conflict and the Bible's wrong? Go back and read it, St. Augustine, 400 AD, writing about Genesis. He was obsessed about Genesis. What does it mean? And one of the things he says is, let no one try to put forward a particular interpretation of this as if that has to be the right answer, because then more information will come along to prove that wrong, and then people of faith will be made to look stupid. Well, here we are. And that is exactly what I'm afraid has been happening ever since. So, and if you really want to make sense out of Genesis 1 and 2 and see how this really fits, go read John Walton's book. John is an Old Testament theologian at Wheaton, which is not exactly a liberal institution. Right. And his book, The Lost World of Genesis 1, is so illuminating in terms of imagining what the first people who read Genesis 1 thought it meant, because that's probably the view we ought to take instead of imposing our current modern, especially modern American view on what the meaning are of those words. So I think when we basically try to find those conflicts and see whether they make sense, if you're ready to accept the idea that there is harmony there. It's not that hard to find. But there are certainly people dug in who are not comfortable with that. And ever since the Scopes trial in the United States, how many people know what the Scopes trial was? You do. It was exactly 100 years ago.
Yep.
Go and read about it. This is when basically evolution was on trial
Literally.
in Dayton, Tennessee.
Right.
And it did not turn out well for anybody. And it created this huge sense of divisiveness between science and Christian faith, which still echoes to this day, and is, I think, one of the reasons that Christians, especially white evangelical Christians, that includes me in that group, were the most likely to say no to vaccines. It was still there. That memory of science is not our friend.
So I got Layla and then on the back. So you want to go first? No.
Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. I have another question on the topic of science communication.
Yeah.
And I think maybe related to your We Are Living Proof project. I'm curious how you think we make science and medical research a bipartisan issue again, and where that needs to start, as in whether that's a bottom-up or a top-down issue, and like if politicians need to take the lead, or the people, or scientists.
Yeah, I wish I could say politicians would take the lead, but I'm really worried about that.
Yeah.
Every survey would say that politicians are more polarized than the country is, by a lot. So that doesn't bode well. And the way it's played out, it seems as if your political party is the strongest predictor about whether you trust science or not. So I think it's going to have to come from the bottom up for the most part. But how to get there? I think the case is really strong. Disease does not care what party you're involved in. It's coming for you. I wrote a song about this. Disease doesn't care if you're left or right. Disease does not care if you're black, brown, or white. Disease don't care if you're old or young. Disease don't care about your mother tongue. Disease don't care about your life's pursuit. You can wear a hoodie or a three-piece suit. It's all true, right?
Was this one of the songs you did at the Gates meetings?
I
that
probably
you,
did.
I,
Yeah,
exactly.
probably at some point. So that ought to be enough, but of course that assumes we're all rational actors, which has been a little harder to appreciate these days, because we are all at risk. And that's, I think, how I had the best opportunity as NIH director to continually to convince every member of Congress that I got to go see. And I probably had 1,000 face-to-face meetings with members of Congress. And only one of those went badly. I won't tell you which one. And the other 999 always went well, because people would go, oh yeah, I was worried about that one. And I will tell you, I learned a lot about the medical and family histories of members of Congress, because that was often the way you could really get their attention. Oh, you're working on that? Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, my wife has early Parkinson's disease, and I didn't know what you were doing on that. So those kinds of things, they're universal. And that ought to be enough to take things out of partisan space, but everything is in partisan space right now. And it's been sort of taken away from where it should be, and we got to try to pull it back. And I think that's kind of up to all of us. And I don't mean to dump on Congress universally, because there are still heroes in that space. But boy, they're outnumbered. And right now, a lot of them are just hiding under the desk, waiting for the trouble to pass.
So I think we covered people enrolled in the class. And so I'd like to offer, oh, I'm sorry, did I miss you earlier? Okay, did anybody else? All right, so how about one more from the class, and then we'll do one more in the room, and then maybe see if we can squeeze one in online, if that's okay.
Sure.
Please, short question.
So having worked as a research tech at an epigenetics lab, I've always found sequencing methods and bioinformatics very interesting. So I wanted to ask, do you remember any specific breakthroughs in research techniques that accelerated the progress of the Human Genome Project?
There were a lot, but certainly automated DNA sequencing. When the project started, we were still using mostly these very long gels that you had to pour, and if you got a bubble in the middle, the whole thing didn't work anymore. And it was all done with P32, so everything was radioactive. It was like not a good scene. And Lee Hood developing the automated sequencer that used fluorescent tags, and then the things that happened after that with capillaries, and now things like Illumina, which is so much faster. And yet we were able to go in a direction that was faster, better, and cheaper, all three. And that isn't supposed to happen. Usually you have to pick 2 out of 3, but this time it was all 3. And it's continued. And technologies have driven so much of what we can do. The idea you can make stem cells from healthy people and turn them into whatever tissue you want to is just amazing. The fact that you can study single cells, that's an omics trick now. Ask that single cell, what are you doing? And get an answer based on its RNA expression. And then there's CRISPR. So you put those all together and it opens up whole new vistas of opportunities that I didn't know were going to happen 15 or 20 years ago, but now everybody's doing it, and who knows what the next one is. There's going to be more.
So we're going to group our last 2. Sophie, if you can pull one from online, and then the gentleman in the back. Go ahead. Why don't you start yours and we'll group it together.
Of course. Thank you very much for this conversation. You were actually my dad's genetics professor, too.
So, you must have been in the medical class at the University of Michigan.
Exactly, yes. But my question was, what is the next Human Genome Project?
I think the Brain Initiative,
Okay.
although it's much harder than the genome because it's 3-dimensional and time matters a lot in terms of how those circuits are operating. And it's 10 years along, and it'll be, I'm sure, many more decades before we could say, okay, we really understand how the brain works, but we've made a lot of progress.
And Sophie, let's pull the last question from our 100 folks on the internet.
Sure, yeah. I have some comments here also. Just someone wanted to tell you that what a fabulous storyteller you are, and they're really excited to be able to listen to you talk today.
Oh, that's very nice. I told way too many stories, and it took us the first 45 minutes before we got me past college, I think.
That's all right.
But yes, so yeah, I would love to ask this question. You mentioned some of the skills that scientists now have to learn to be able to communicate to the public. And one question I have is, what are some skills that scientists would need to learn and be able to recognize, to be able to work with faith actors and faith leaders, to be able to work together on the issue of trust, and how that relates to public health and global health?
Yeah. Well, very quickly, I think scientists need to be ready to give a short sort of elevator speech kind of description of what they are working on in a fashion that somebody who's not a scientist and maybe doesn't have more than an 8th or 9th grade education can immediately get it. And also to be unashamed of being excited about this. It's not like you're giving, a 10-minute presentation at your scientific meeting. You're presenting yourself. Here's why I'm doing this. Here's why I'm excited about where it might go. That catches people's attention. When it comes to conversations with people of faith, be respectful. Ask questions like, tell me about what your view is of what I just talked to you about in terms of science. What's been your experience? Are the things that worry you? Get to know them a little bit. That's the first step in any of these conversations where you're not quite sure whether you're going to be able to get along. Listening to understand, not just to plan your response, but listening to understand. That's always the right answer.
I told you all this would be a special night, and I think it was. So, but I'd like to, as our tradition, I'd like to ask everybody to join me in a round of applause for our speaker.